Have you ever heard of gardening by the moon? And no, I don't mean sitting out at night planting by moonlight. I'm Willow at Tuto Farm, and today I'm walking you through how to make a DIY lunar gardening calendar while explaining what that is and how to use it. When I lived and worked on Four Elements Herbal's organic farm, we practiced what Jane Stevens called celestial gardening. We used the lunar cycle to guide everything from planting and weeding and harvesting based on how the moon's gravitational pull influenced plant growth. Now, I've not used this practice since leaving the farm, but Jane's recent book, Celestial Gardening, has me inspired to use this method as a way to guide my gardening practices this year. This might sound unscientific, but when you consider the moon's influence on our oceans and even our own biology, it makes sense to suspect that it has an impact on how plants grow. While there's not much scientific support for the moon's impact on plants, there has been evidence that there's higher releases of pollen on a full moon, which may have to do with night pollinators. If nothing else, it does offer a rhythm to ensure all aspects of your garden are being tended to, especially weeding and pruning. Of course, there's apps and pre-made calendars that you can buy, but of course I went about making my own, so I can use it year after year just by recalibrating it annually. I started by making two large circles, one for the days of the year and the other for the phases of the moon. The larger one I divided into 12 segments, one for each month. The lunar one was a little harder, as there are 12 and 1/3 moon cycles per calendar year. I did some math dividing up the circumference by 12 times 3 plus 1, and then multiplied that number by 3 to get the measurements for one moon cycle. After making those lines, I then split them up into 4, representing each phase. You could divide this however makes sense for you. Some people prefer 3 or even 8 phases. On the year wheel, I added days, counting by 5s, and I drew solstice and equinox lines and colored them based on the correlating elements: blue for water, yellow for air, red for fire, and green for earth. You'll see these colors throughout the calendar that represent correlating planting guidelines. I added zodiac signs within each month just for fun and used a similar color pattern for each of these signs. I will add that this is following the astrological calendar and not the present day astronomical schedule of where these constellations are present today. Many of these calendars typically include zodiac cycles with both sun and moon signs, but I chose just to incorporate the basics since that makes it really complex, and I have not found compelling evidence that this impacts plant growth for me. As for the moon wheel, I also divided that up into 4 segments for each phase, correlated with those colors. So while I'm working on this, let me tell you a little bit about what each lunar phase means for the garden. The new moon, when a full shadow is cast across it, is correlated with the dormant and wet season conditions. This is the planning period for gardeners and life in general. This is a good time to map out the garden, go through your seeds, and prep your soil. As the moon begins to reappear through waxing, it's the time to plant annuals and fruiting plants that focus their energy on their tops. The wet conditions encourage life and growth as many of our plants begin to establish roots really deep down. As the moon's shadow recedes, you can move on to transplanting and pruning and taking cuttings. The element of air takes stage, and this is also time for problem solving and overcoming obstacles in the garden, such as those pesky cucumber beetles and squash bugs. The full moon is a time for harvest and celebration. It's a good time to take time to appreciate the plants in your garden and show some gratitude. As the moon starts to wane and disappear again, it's a good time to plant root crops like carrots and potatoes, and the energy is drawn back downwards into the soil. This is a drying phase, also a fire phase, which is really good for harvesting and drying and preserving. So this is a really good time to bust out the canning jars. It's also a perfect time to weed and to thin, both in garden and in life, discarding and releasing what you don't need anymore. As the moon continues to wane and disappear behind the shadows, you can start to reflect and prepare for winter and spring crops. Think about what went well and what you're going to do differently next year. The earth phase merges back into water as the cycle starts all over again. The moon's rhythm can be applied to more than just gardening. Sometimes I like to incorporate the ebb and flow of outward and inward energy into my own life, setting time to plan, act, and reflect. Sometimes I get caught up in feeling the need to be constantly productive, but without time to reflect or adequately plan, I end up wasting a lot of energy. Now that I've cut out both of those wheels, I'm going to connect them. So I used a little pin and a button and some string to loop them through so that they can still connect and move freely at the same time. Next, I used a little hole puncher to punch a bunch of tiny white circles out. I'm using these as little moons to mark the different phases on my calendar. I used a marker to differentiate the waxing and waning marks on the little moons. I used a glue stick to tediously stick these all on here, but if I were to do it again, I'd probably just draw them on. Next, I wanted to make a little key that I could add to the center so that I always knew to refer to it for what the different phases meant. If you were to make a monthly calendar instead of an annual like mine, this would be a really good foundation piece. I honestly wasn't a huge fan of the way that the colors turned out on this. It kind of looked like a circus tent to me, so when I was doing the moon key, I decided to add some purple. It's always important to, if you're going to make something, make it beautiful so that you actually want to look at it or use it. After the paint dried, I added details corresponding with the moon phases for what actions I should be doing for each of those phases. I thought about drawing lines kind of separating the different phases on this, but since it's such a cyclical process and they overlap, I left it as is and kind of just wrote them in the vague areas. I have seen versions of this where it's just a month on the wheel instead of a year, and you just have to recalibrate it at the end of each month. And I did this one because I wanted to be able to plan far in advance, but I might make a monthly one too, just because it seems a little bit easier. I would love to hear it if there are people out there who have done their own calendars and have any preference versus the year or the month. I will say that sometimes the best time to pick or harvest or weed is when you're there and the plant is there. The goal of this is really just to offer a cyclical rhythm to gardening rather than a rigid schedule to adhere to. Sometimes there's just life circumstances or weather that don't really permit for this type of routine or schedule. All right, the last step with this is to line it up with the right moon phases and pin it in place. Thanks for joining, and please let me know if you've tried gardening by the moon and what your experience has been. I'd also love to know if there's specific gardening techniques or different types of videos that you'd like to see.